Okay, everybody ready? We'll start our next one. Agenda. This is the Selma City Council special meeting, March 26, 2024. It is 11:13 a.m. in the Selma City Council chambers. We're going to call this meeting to order, and I'm going to ask for a roll call from the city clerk.
Councilmember Guerra.
Here.
Councilmember Mendoza-Navarro.
Here.
Councilmember Trujillo.
Here.
Mayor Pro Tem Cho.
Here.
Mayor Robertson.
Here. Potential conflicts of interest. Any council member has a potential conflict of interest may now identify the item and recuse themselves from discussing and voting on the matter. Agenda changes or deletions to better accommodate members of the public or inconvenience in the order of presentation. Items on the agenda may not be presented or acted upon in the order listed. Additions to agenda may be added only pursuant to California Government Code, Section 54954.2B. Oral communications at this time, any member of the public may address City Council regarding any item on the special meeting agenda over which the council has jurisdiction. No action or discussion will be taken on any item not on the agenda. Issues raised will be referred to the city manager for her review. Members of the public are asked to limit their remarks to 3 minutes. That, hearing anybody online or on the phone who would like to say anything?
As a reminder to the caller that I see online, please use your raise your hand feature and we will add you to the meeting queue. Mayor Robertson, at this time, I see no hands raised.
Okay, thank you. With that, we'll move on to our one and only topic. This is a study session on the Comprehensive Zoning Code Update Workshop.
Thank you, Mayor. Before you today, staff sent out, I think, some study materials. So the council had some homework over the last week. It is not a small document, 237 pages of zoning code, which is a exciting read if you're a planner, maybe. But it is exciting for the city in the fact that I do not believe this type of update has been done for a significant amount of time to bring the zoning code into compliance with state housing law and typical practice, typical planning practice to accommodate mixed use, accessory dwelling units, and a variety of uses that may not have previously been considered under the prior zoning code. So with that, staff has a short presentation. We want to keep it short so we can have some dialogue and some conversation regarding some of the changes in the zoning code, and then also allow council time following this workshop to maybe further review the zoning code and propose some corrections, comments, revisions, additions at a future council meeting where we would have the first reading of the zoning ordinance and propose some amendments. But with that, staff just has a short presentation. So as we stated, this is a public workshop to garner some comment from council and the public regarding the proposed zoning code update. The zoning code update was the product of a SB2 grant that was awarded to the city in October 2020.
Excuse me, Deputy City Manager. Can we get this email to all the council members?
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Absolutely. And prerequisites have been met as part of that grant that have allowed us to be reimbursed for the work that was completed as part of this project. The remaining steps really are what we're doing now, as well as the adoption of the zoning code to complete all of the requirements of the grant. But we have been reimbursed for our work on this grant and fulfilled the reporting requirements. The remaining item would just be the adoption of the zoning code. The zoning code before you was recommended for approval by the Planning Commission, and adoption of the update is, as I stated, the only remaining step apart from any other revisions that council would have. Next slide. So what is a zoning ordinance? The zoning ordinance is a regulatory code adopted by a local jurisdiction to maintain consistencies between development projects across zone districts. It also is the implementation arm of your general plan in terms of if you have policies, specific design criteria, which was discussed last night at Planning Commission, this would be a way to implement some of those policies that are adopted in your land use plan. And so what we've done throughout the zoning code is we've added many more tables to kind of consolidate areas of the zoning code that were otherwise confusing, conflicting. and otherwise hard to find to show what the development process is, who the reviewing authority is for various types of applications. So as you can see in the table on the screen, for example, a site plan review is reviewed at the director level. It's a staff level approval, and it is appealed to Planning Commission and City Council. A preliminary development permit, we would just recommend. It's not really an action. It's stating these would be the requirement and this would be the process to go forward. Other things like conditional use permits, temporary use permits, again, it shows that the director recommends to Planning Commission for decision with it being appealable to City Council. This is all in one spot. I think currently it is about 3 different chapters in the zoning code, and it's easily represented in a single table. So many of the revisions in the zoning code consolidate a lot of information that was otherwise, hard to find in various sections, but a lot of it's very similar and a lot of it should resemble the same process across permits, right? So what we tried to do was simplify it for the public as well as future staff to implement it consistently over time. Similar with the development standards in various districts, what you would see in our residential zones, we have the commercial zones up on the screen. Industrial is we show the cross-section of the zone districts and what the minimum requirements are in a single table. So comparatively speaking, you could compare what size, lot is required for a C1 district versus a C2 district versus a C3 district, or a commercial highway district. You can compare those requirements very easily across the board for developers or the general public to understand what they're allowed to do on their property. So these are the type of items that I believe were intended as part of the original grant application, of more streamlined information to developers, the general public, of what they're actually allowed to do on their property. Any questions? Bye. So why is the zoning ordinance being updated? The zoning ordinance drives the development landscape of the city across all properties within the city. It promotes consistency with the general plan. It helps clearly define procedures for how applications are processed across the board for transparency purposes. And we removed a lot of the subjective interpretations, right? Under SB 330, we talked about with the objective design standards that you're no longer allowed to have more subjective interpretation and have very broad policies, this more specifically towards housing developments, right? So to promote housing developments in a more streamlined fashion, the state remove the ability of the cities to have subjective standards, and each city is required to adopt more objective standards that clearly delineate what they need to meet, what hurdles do they need to clear in order to meet the requirements of the city. So for transparency, those have been added. User friendly, like I stated, we've consolidated a lot of chapters. We've removed a lot of chapters that were unnecessary or repetitive. We've removed kind of that domino effect that we have in the existing zoning ordinance, where you could theoretically do uses that aren't specifically listed, but it references other zone districts. So as an example, I think in the existing industrial districts, it reversed to commercial as being an allowed use. But then if you go to that commercial district, the underlying commercial district is an allowed use, and so on and so forth down to R3. So in theory, you could still do R3 uses in the industrial zone. And so we've removed that because you generate some incompatibility issues when you have and you allow those uses by right in specific zones. And from a standpoint of environmental review and just general development standard and nuisance abatement, if you approved a residential project in an industrial zone, you could have environmental justice issues, you could have noise abatement on existing businesses in the industrial park because there is a residential project there now, right? So we've removed that so that we have a more compatible zoning ordinance for implementation purposes, so there's no confusion of what's allowed in what zone district. We've added visual aids to help implement some of the more stringent requirements, such as vision setbacks on corners. That is an issue that is not easily understood if it's articulated in a zoning ordinance, right? But a visual that shows you have to have, and this is just an example, 20-foot clearance on the corners, and you can't put anything over 30 inches in that triangle on a corner so that you're not obstructing motorists. If you have a visual, that makes it easy for someone to show it on their site plan. And then we have a more extensive list of definitions. There's many definitions in our zoning ordinance that appear nowhere else except in the singular sentence that they're stated. And so the list of definitions is extremely important when you have uses, and I think we saw this maybe with special events. We have a clear definition of what special events is now in our zoning ordinance, as the council adopted a special event ordinance update that has an extensive definition of what special events are. When we have uses such as a gas station versus, a machine shop, those are not one and the same. However, our current zoning ordinance, I believe, refers to service station. What is a service station, right? Does it cover, body repair? Does it cover gas? Does it cover oil changes? What are the limitations of that type of use? So having clear and concise definitions that match the list of uses in your zoning ordinance is extremely important for implementation purposes to ensure the uses that you want to see in a zone district are specific to the zone district where they're permitted, right? Compliance, there have been numerous state laws with that refer to accessory dwelling units that we have to update our zoning ordinance to comply with. This update covers those. It ensures that we are consistent with all those laws to allow a multitude of housing options, accessory dwelling units, junior dwelling units. It also implements some of our 6-cycle housing element criteria for transitional housing locations, support, I think it's transitional supportive, permanent supportive housing. So, we were still behind on implementing those within our zoning ordinance as well. So this has helped get us in line, and we can show that amendment as part of our current housing element that we're in compliance, right? And then intention, it's meant to help streamline the development process, to give clear guidance to developers when they come in of what's allowed. Where it was a long conversation last night at Planning Commission, what's in the zoning ordinance? What are the development standards? Well, there's different ways to implement standards. When you have certain projects, maybe it needs to be consistent with the general plan. However, as I stated earlier, your zoning ordinance is the implementation arm of your general plan. If you have policies that are rather broad, you develop standards in your zoning ordinance that are then applied. However, our general plan does have specific standards that we can also apply, but they should be in the zoning ordinance to identify when and where they're applied, right? And then ensure consistent implementation over time. When the zoning ordinance is clear and concise, it doesn't matter if I'm here, the zoning ordinance is clear for Kamara to implement, the city planner, assistant planner, Macias to implement. Developers clearly understand what they're allowed to do. So we removed a lot of the, ambiguity in the zoning ordinance so that when people come in and you read a specific requirement, what the allowance is, it's clear where we're going with it. And I think the current zoning ordinance over time has been open to a lot of interpretation, which has led to a lot of inconsistencies with development. And what you want is you want it to be able to be implemented the same way over time, so it's fair. Next slide. So as we stated, what are some of the major updates? There's new procedures. We'll start with the preliminary development review process, which I believe we've talked about during development workshops and kind of ad hoc at various other times. Staff is proposing in the new zoning ordinance update that it be mandatory. However, what we would like to see is a specific credit given to developers when they subsequently submit their entitlement application, right? So they pay the fee, they go through the preliminary development review process so staff can help guide them on what they need to correct in their plan, what they need to include, what they need to consider, what appropriate entitlement applications need to be submitted, what the anticipated environmental review is. They pay the fee, and then that fee is carried over to when they submit their entitlement applications. That is credited off the top. Yes, sir.
Who conducts the preliminary
It
development
would be
review?
community development staff in accordance with other city departments and agencies. So it's similar to our current PRC process, follows a similar alignment. We changed the name so it's clear what it's meant to do. And it's not just for preliminary subdivision map, it's for development, right? And so it would run a similar process to what we do now. The submittal requirements are a little bit less stringent because when people have a preliminary development project, they're not going to do full construction documents, nor would we want them to, because it's an exorbitant cost for them to do it. However, we do have minimum standards for what they would submit to give us enough information to help guide them on what they need to do going forward.
Developers come to my office, they ask me, they've got a proposed project. I send them to City Hall. Is that the best way to do it, or can they go online, or what's the best way for them to start the process? A pre-development review or jump right into it?
I mean, under the proposed process, they wouldn't do they couldn't just submit their entitlement application. They would need to go through the preliminary review process so that everybody's on the same page, because we have numerous projects that didn't go through a preliminary development review process that are now in, I don't know, in limbo or in circular, process where they didn't understand what they were getting themselves into per se, in terms of the jurisdictional issues, maybe with sphere of influence amendments or infrastructure issues or what have you. And now they've paid fees, and now they're stuck with a project that they don't know that they can finish. So the preliminary development review process is meant to give people an entry level view of what the expectations are for the project that they want to do.
Deputy
That's not-
City Manager, is there a cost to that?
There currently is, I think it's about $2,000.
Okay.
But again, that would be credited towards their future application. So what we're trying to encourage them to
Move
do
forward.
is to go through a formal process to get comments. And then they know what they need to do, and then they subsequently submit their application. It's basically a no-cost process, right? At the end of the day, everybody's on the same page and they get their money back with an understanding of what they need to complete.
City manager, I'm sorry, deputy city manager. I know I'm looking over here. But in those situations, where they didn't know what they got themselves into and now they paid these, and they're in limbo. What are we doing about that?
We still communicate with them regularly. The fact of the matter is some of the requirements are beyond what the city should be obligated to do.
Mhm.
There's are applications that maybe that applicant should submit on their own behalf and carry the water for that project because it's further outside the city. There's significant infrastructure that needs to be installed, et cetera. And in some cases, the projects may be premature for the area, right? And so staff advises them like there's issues and we're not 100% staff may support this development at this time. But we're in communication with them about what their requirements are, and we put them in writing, and we try to organize meetings as we can with the appropriate agencies that they need to talk to.
I'll move on to the next one. It'll be coming up pretty
Okay.
soon.
Okay. So that's the preliminary development review process that we've added. Again, it's currently voluntary. Staff is recommending it be mandatory, but we would come back with an ordinance to make the fee 100% creditable if they submit it within like a year. We also have director review and approval. This just is a more streamlined process for some maybe minor type uses. Zoning clearance letters is a very similar type process that's used in many jurisdictions to justify what somebody's proposing on a minor scale. And then we also have temporary use permits that are also added, I think, for storage and various other temporary uses, maybe Christmas tree lots, firework, whatever. The consolidation and ease of use, we use the use classification matrices that we showed on the last page that show the various zone districts side by side, have completed for all the zone districts. We consolidated 35 chapters into 8 chapters. So that just tells you the type of conciseness we're trying to get to, where people would previously have to mull through pages and pages of the zoning ordinance to try and find their requirements, right? Residential and housing changes, we've added in compliance with state law, the accessory dwelling unit regulations. We've added new residential use types consistent with the Fair Housing Act and Housing Pricing Act of 2019. We've added some of draft objective design standards and single-family development standards based on feedback from the joint workshop. We've revised development standards for all the zone districts, intuitive and relative to minimum parcel sizes. I think there was an issue with some of the parcel sizes just being larger than what would be considered the common practice in the region. We've also added, I think, a district that's down to 4,000 square feet to allow developers to not have to go through a planned unit development process to do smaller lot sizes and also to meet general plan density requirements. With rising construction costs, with interest rates higher than they've been, in the recent historically, there need to be various housing options for developers to get people to come to the city. And not to say that 7,000 square foot lots can't be sold, but the market dictates that maybe a smaller lot is more affordable for the region. And so making that a by right type of land use consistent with the general plan allows developers to come in and propose a subdivision that is much more in line with the current market conditions. And then we added the major and minor home occupation. So I know that this has been an issue that's been brought before the council. Our current home occupation standards require everybody to pay a fee, go through a review and a notification to surrounding owners, and one owner can object and it becomes an appeal. And it's a very arduous process for someone that wants to run a home business. As we know, there's more of a propensity for people wanting to run a home business these days due to costs and being independent, what have you. So what we've developed in the zoning ordinance update is a minor zoning ordinance or minor home occupation and a major home occupation. The minor is really someone keeping their books for their business, keeping very limited paperwork. Maybe it's like an Etsy store. I don't know. And they have an LLC for tax purposes, right? Nobody comes to their house. If you were living in their neighborhood, they would have no idea that somebody's running a business out of their house, right? That type of minor home occupation we've clearly defined, and the way we view that is it doesn't have to go through a review process. They sign the development standards for that minor home occupation, stating that I understand I can't have customers. I can't have significant outdoor storage. I can't have signage. I can't do a lot of things. And it keeps the residential neighborhood looking the same as it should, and it doesn't impact my neighbors. That type of use would just be a standard business license application reviewed by staff and approved. The major would be more along the lines of what a lot of communities deem a cottage industry type permit, where you have maybe customers come by appointment only. This would be people that maybe cut hair. They're accountants. They're, some sort of cooking was a state law that was added, right? And so those type of items that you can have customers by appointment, but we put a limitation. I think it's up to 6 or 8 per day by appointment only, right? And that type of permit would run our typical home occupation process, that it goes through review, it goes through inspections to ensure that they have proper standards at their house, has limited signage, but again, it has standards to minimize the impact to the surrounding residential neighborhood, which I want to highlight. It's a residential neighborhood, not a commercial neighborhood, right? So having customers just show up at your house is not permitted. It is strictly by appointment only, and there's a limitation on that. And again, they would submit a formal application and would go through staff for review. They would acknowledge what the development requirements are for that type of use. There's a slightly different application fee than the minor home occupation, but it goes through a review process.
So there's an infraction of that, and say the neighbor says, I can't get anywhere with the city. They could sue that neighbor who's doing that and use those standards as a basis for their legal action. Is that correct? If that neighbor is not meeting those standards?
I mean, it would be a code enforcement action, I think, is the process. What we would expect is if a resident understands, because we go through a notification of the neighborhood of, hey, there's a home occupation being proposed. Here's what it is. And if it's approved, the neighborhood, as with all code enforcement actions, we rely on the public to report those, right? And so if someone says, they're just having people come to their house, we would go out and conduct an investigation and cite them appropriately. And this is actually a permit that could actually be revoked if they were found to be out of compliance.
Got it. And there's a gradual graduation process from a warning to a
It
site
would
to
go through a
removal of the
typical
permit.
admin citation process through the city of Selma.
And to your point, Mayor, there's nothing that would prevent a neighbor from taking civil action against
Right.
another neighbor, regardless of what process the city's going through with
Could
them.
they use the standards, the city standards as a basis for their legal action?
Probably, I'm sure, yeah.
So for commercial industrial development, we added a specific mixed use type use that has clear standards for what the expectation would be for a mixed use project to the commercial zones. We implemented standards for the existing central business district downtown. We have specific development criteria for gas stations at intersections. Currently, and in most cities, they limit the number of gas stations at a major commercial intersection, right? Because you may not want all four corners to be commercial. You may want a variety of uses. So staff has proposed a limitation of, I believe it's 2 at a major intersection. And then some of the outdated commercial uses were either renamed to what they're currently referred to. I referred to gas station from service station. I haven't heard something called a service station since I was a kid. And they were either renamed or removed. I mean, I've seen in zoning ordinances that have gone years without updating, they still refer to blacksmiths in some zoning ordinances, right? And so I'm not saying it's in ours, I'm saying I've seen it, right? Blacksmith, yes. I know of one jurisdiction that's but anyway, what we tried to do was we tried to update the definitions, not only to make clear what uses are allowed, but that they're up to date. And then the definitions, we consolidated all the definitions into one chapter and provided additional definitions specifically regarding different housing types. So that's a summary of the highlights and the major changes that you'll see in the zoning ordinance update. We're here today to hear if you guys have any comments, suggestions, and then allow staff to make future revisions if you guys have identified anything before it's presented formally for a first reading before the city council. Available for any questions you may have.
What's the process for this becoming adopted by the city?
It would follow a typical ordinance adoption, first reading, second reading, and then it would go into effect 30 days after. And I think this would be a full repeal and replace of the existing zoning chapter within the municipal code.
So the municipal code just gets changed. What was in it before gets deleted and this replaces it.
Right.
Got it.
Let me ask you again. I want to go back to the timing and the credit for individuals that, have a project or purchase, let's say a building. What's their time frame for individuals that maybe start a project and sit there for years and don't do anything? Are we, as a city, requiring them to finish their project within a certain time? Or how is that working?
So we typically have limitations of time for their permit being active, and it can expire and then they would have to resubmit. And so we've had instances, we have an instance now where we've had to reach out to applicants that have, I'm going to say, active projects with approved conditional use permits or site plan reviews or other items that are coming up on their expiration date. So we reach out to them to find out, are you going to finish your project? Do you need an extension? What are the reasons for the extension? And I believe our current extension or the current zoning ordinance doesn't really have any findings that need to be made for granting an extension. But I mean, the circumstances vary, right? From finances to maybe market conditions that they don't want to do that use anymore because they don't view it as profitable, or it was a fad and people have gone away from that type of use. I know arcades were like a huge thing when I was a kid, and then they went to kind of gaming rooms, I think, where they have a bunch of computers that people can go and play. Um, Times change. And so if you're a developer and you purchase a building, or you're just a property owner and you purchase a building, the type of use that you go and you propose to do may change over time. I do believe that part of the discussion today shed some light on maybe some hindrances to the development process, which maybe it's infrastructure, maybe it's the condition of the building. I know we run into issues with older buildings having to be brought up to ADA compliance that, you know, we're trying to inform people as early as possible that that's an issue so that they can budget appropriately. And I don't know how much of that outreach was done years ago with these projects that are still on the books. But staff here, we reach out constantly to property owners that have purchased projects, that have permits in process, to find out what their status is. Is there something that they need from us? Can we help out to guide them through? Do they need a meeting? We schedule meetings all the time with small time, big time, whoever, to discuss what the needs are of their current building permit, what issues are they having. I mean, I had one yesterday. I got an email at about 3 o'clock, and we have a meeting scheduled for Wednesday at 3 to go over what their inspection has shown as part of their tenant improvement. So we go through that exercise for active projects, thank you, for proposed projects before they started construction. So it's a constant process in community development.
Councilmember Guerra, I just want to be sure that that answered your concern, or get to the root of what your concern is about these
Well,
projects. Yeah.
I mean, I get it all the time, and, you know, just, and we know because we purchased an old building and we had to do the renovations, and staff back then, when we had pull permits and get our contractor out there to do everything, I mean, we were within a period of time, right? We had to get it done. And
We had to pay again.
we had to pay again. So when I see buildings that no one's doing nothing to them, maybe they replaced a window here and there. Well, why is that holding up? I mean, why? What I'm trying to point is, when I talk to individuals, and especially our board of supervisors that give me a lot of great information, those are the things that they tell us. You know, you got to put limitations. You want to get your city going, you can't have rundown bill. You got to start putting, you know, holding people accountable. And that means, you know, for years, we talked about, let's do a color scheme. You know, we did. We're like, let's get on it. You know, we'll do it we're all on board. Hey, we'll paint our buildings. And then, you know, that fell through the cracks and it went somewhere else. And, you know, we're now with the bid. You know, that's one thing that I tell the bid. I've been vocal about that. What are they going to start doing? Because we want to see results. We bought into something and we want to see results for our downtown. And, you know, when people come through our town, God, your buildings look the same. You know, it's sad because we want to move forward. And I'll tell you guys, you know, our staff today was impressive, you know, we got to move forward, you know. That's our team. But we can't move forward if we're just gonna, well, just, you know, let these buildings go. We gotta set guidelines, you know, and when I mean guidelines, that means we gotta help out, you know. Where are we today? We pulled permits. Okay, so is your project gonna take 6 months? Because that's how they were on us. How long is this gonna take? 6 months? Or is your project gonna be done in 12 months? But we want to know. I mean, we were on a time, I mean, I'm sure Councilmember Trujillo was under the same kind of rules back then that we were under. We didn't have these, oh, well, let your building sit for 3 years and don't do nothing to it, you know? We weren't on that kind of, I mean,
it-
I could have went and rented an office space and said, screw it, save some money and, but we didn't do that.
Right.
Cause
And
that's not, I would say the conditions that we were under, and I have to agree with some of these, like Nathan and Buddy, they tell me, you guys gotta hold people accountable. And we do, they held us to account, right? They held us accountable.
We did.
I'm sure they held Councilmember Trujillo accountable.
Just real quick, in regards to that, I did, in 2012, I started building a restaurant and the city came back twice to me and told me, you passed 2 months and I had to repay a fee. And we did, I think we're talking about apples to oranges because I do see the projects you're actually talking about, but I understand where Buddy and Nathan are coming from, but at the end of the day, the policies and procedures, what they're really saying is that we need to stick to those plans and actually have enforce them and keep them up to it, because at the end of the day, if a developer comes and purchases a building in our community and lets it sit there and never does anything with it, I think that's a different question of to how we can actually implement it in our policies, because I mean, for us, we're residents here and we're investing and we want to make sure we're trying, right? And we were held to a different, and that's between you, before you guys, to a different standard. And I did participate in exactly what they participated, that, my project went over a year because I didn't have all the funds. I had to pay an extra fee.
I think, to Councilmember Trujillo's point, I think that's really the question. As a property owner, you purchase a building, you might do due diligence for a year or two to understand what the market is, what my finances will allow for construction. Does my building allow me to do certain things? For example, do I need to put in an elevator if I put in
Right.
residential on the top floor? So as a property owner, you purchase a building and you want to figure out what you're able to do. Once the project starts, I think that's a different question, because there are specific limitations from when a building permit is issued, when your next inspection is passed, of whether or not that permit expires. And I think that's a different question that we still hold people accountable to when they get building permits based on their last inspection. That permit can expire and we notify them that it's going to expire and that they need to move forward. Now, I don't know if that kind of separates the two issues that we're discussing.
Yeah, I think that's a great insight as to how our process works when building permits are issued and somebody delays the construction related to those permits. I think Councilmember Guerra, you're part of the main concern is that there's buildings around town that are dilapidated and that are not being kept up by by the owners of the property, right?
Yeah.
And so how do we develop policies to either prevent that from happening, or for existing buildings that are in that state, how do we require them to bring them up to a standard that we set, right? Which is different from,
Sure.
we issue a
That's right,
permit,
right.
they take forever, we make them pay again, which is still our process, right? So if that's something that you would like us to explore, which I agree is something that we should explore, because existing dilapidated buildings is a problem. It's blight, right? And so the city has certain leeway in terms of addressing blight through different avenues. It just has to be a policy that we create to be able to address that.
I believe the term is an attractive nuisance, which is a weird term.
And it affects our economic development, right? If
Sure.
we're trying to attract people to downtown and there's buildings that look terrible relative to the rest of the buildings that, for example, that you've invested in, it doesn't help us with our economic development efforts.
But I believe that this type of exercise we're going through is the first step. Obviously, as planners, we understand the work we do today is going to take some time to be implemented, right? We're not going to see you adopt it. Let's say we adopted it today and it goes into effect today. What happens today? Someone still has to submit an application. It still has to go through review. So what you guys approve today, you might not see for 2 years
Yeah.
the effects of it. And it's that type of patience and understanding and kind of, I'm not going to say faith, but the understanding that this is a positive step forward to getting where we want to be, but it takes time. It's different than an infrastructure project that we award the bid and they're out 3 weeks with parking cones blocking traffic and you see it going immediately, right? With planning, we all understand on this side of the table that the regulations and the policies and the processes that we revise today, we'll begin implementing, and it will help us to, review and approve better projects down the road, but it is a process.
And then if I could add, just to expand on Jerome's point and to kind of dive more into the preliminary development review process, it is just preliminary. So we are front loading all the conditions that the applicant would need to see so they can determine if this is a project that is feasible for them to produce. But it is something, it's not starting the internal clock, correct? It's the preliminary development review. They still have to submit and go through the proper channels for us to reroute to the internal and external agencies, and that clock for us to review can start and to get to planning commission or whatever governing body that is needed to approve the project. And then once approved, there's that 2-year clock for the conditions of approval that they have to address. But that is not starting during the preliminary review process.
Let's say someone wants to build the arts center. Doesn't meet these objective standards. They go to you, is that right, Deputy City Manager? Or they go to the Community Development Director to appeal that,
Well,
and that does, and they're told no. Where do they go from there?
so with any project, if someone appeals conditions or requirements as part of that application, let's say it's a director level review, the zoning ordinance dictates of who they appeal it to. And conditions and requirements that are in the zoning code typically aren't appealable. People can appeal them, but because they're part of the zoning ordinance or their development requirement, they're part of the limitations of what we can waive as part of the project, right?
Council could just change the ordinance, right?
Well,
Ultimately.
I mean, that's, I think, the point is adopting standards that the council is agreeable to so that staff can implement those, so that when they come before you, if someone has an appeal or a grievance to what they're being asked to do, they're part of the ordinance. They've gone through the council and the council's already bought off on these requirements, right? And so if someone had an issue with what staff was requiring, they could appeal it, but because they're part of the ordinance and part of the standards, it shouldn't be overturned.
That's why I think that it's so important. We have development and it's so important because the preliminary is so important because what I see right now is that I see past developers that came to our city in the past that did not have the staffing that we have right now. And they've purchased land. They have that gun ho approach and I go back to the fees, right? But the standard of operation of what we want, and it goes back to Councilwoman, our standards. Hey, we want this to be looking, if you're gonna purchase it, don't just build a shack, build something that's gonna actually come to our standards so we can start elevating it, right? But in reality, it goes back to and we, the council, you're presenting a policy and procedure manual of what we want to have the developer instill to. And these fees are implemented with the standards that we're implementing, but when we have a developer that, reneges on, oh, I don't think I should pay this because the cities all around us are not paying this amount. Well, I always come up and say, well, yeah, but if our standards are higher, then these are the fees. But in regards to us as council, we're gonna have to make a decision as to where our standards are gonna be and how much it actually is gonna come to, because at the end of the day, once we approve it, and it keeps on coming back to staff saying, hey, these guys, well, I don't think I should pay this because they're all paying this. Well, it's gonna keep coming back and forth. So it's really important that we understand, like, do we want the standard or do we want it
Right.
cheap?
And,
You know what I mean?
and to the council member's point, I think this is one piece of the pie, right? This is not the whole enchilada. This is part of the development process of the city. We had a long discussion this morning about infrastructure. That's another piece of the pie. That's another enchilada on the plate. That is part of the issue. Fees are another one. Council has already asked staff to take a look and provide a report on fees within the region, right? So we're reviewing the whole picture of what development means in the city. The zoning ordinance update, again, is an implementation arm of the general plan. However, we are also going to be reviewing the general plan as well in the coming months and years, right? We're going to be starting that process. So what we're doing is we're gearing up to make the environment more, you know, appealing to the development community. We've done other things. We talked about it last night at Planning Commission where staff, when we draft conditions, we meet with the developer, the applicant to go over those conditions so that they understand where staff's coming from, but we understand where they're coming from if they feel it's something that needs to be phased at a different part of their development. Like if they have a phased development and they have two parts of frontage, maybe part of the requirements don't occur until phase two. Having those type of open lines of communication is another piece of the development puzzle. And we're reviewing all of those items. We're making those improvements. You heard me last year during the development workshop. We're doing what we can to streamline. This is one thing we're doing to streamline. The review of, draft conditions is another. Fees will be another part of it. General plan policies will be another. Design guidelines will be another. But what we're doing is we're trying to cultivate a culture and an environment to where what we tell on the front end to a developer is consistent all the way through the process, because developers rely on consistency and accurate information in order for their project to be built.
They're gonna want to get the absolute lowest deal and pay the absolute lowest amount. And the city has a history of accommodating those needs. I mean, some great housing subdivisions didn't really help us, our city, for the future. They were great housing. They're a great housing subdivision. People still live there. It's an awesome place. But if the particular developer would have had to pay a little more and do a little bit different
there
with
were
those sewer and the
design-
water lines, it could have been.
Or if there was design
could have helped
criteria
us in
to
the
kind
future.
of guide
Mhm.
outer aesthetics of the subdivision, maybe monumentation of signage when you go into the subdivision with landscaping, and there was proper financing in the LLMD to support all of those items to ensure longevity of that stuff. Absolutely. But these are the type of conversations that we're having. These are all issues as part of the entire development process. Again, the zoning code update is a huge step forward for the city, but these other conversations that we're having with regard to what fees should be implemented and what their purpose is a huge part of the discussion. Because if you have lower fees or you waive fees, I've seen community waive fees, which is a different issue. What it does is it hamstrings your ability to finance growth-inducing infrastructure. It limits the ability to make improvements to your infrastructure to accommodate growth, and then it falls back on the shoulders of the developer, and it becomes an absorbent cost for them on the front end, and then they don't build their project. So what you end up having is have what we are doing with Amberwood, where it's a $7 million project. What developer is going to pay $7 million on the front end?
Right.
What we do is we absorb that, not absorb that cost, but we more or less lend the cost to the developers and they pay it back over time through development, right? Or we pay it off with other development impact fees, as well as an incremental fee for people that are directly using that specific improvement. However, that's not to say that impact fees don't serve a purpose. We had this conversation last night that they're an incremental part of mitigating impacts, right? And it's a needed item because we have infrastructure to serve some projects. However, the impact fees that they pay once that infrastructure is at capacity, their impact fees fund new infrastructure for new projects, right? And that's, I think, the viewpoint that has been missed over time is what do those fees actually, what are they meant to do? And that's to mitigate impacts of future development, and so that we can accommodate future development.
That's a great point. And I go back to maybe, I want to say a year that you got hired, or months. How many months has it been?
It is 13 months.
So I want to go back, and there's, from the time that you got hired to right now, I've actually learned that we have two types of developers, right? We have one developer that comes and says to you, hey, what are you doing? I can't even apply at city because I don't have no master plans to actually put my analysis on the job cost of what's it gonna actually cost the project, right? Streets and sewer, right? He's asking for the total enchilada, right? Asking for the total cost because he wants to go and break it down, and that's that type of developer wants, hey, I don't care what your development fees are gonna be, just tell me a good price I can build this project. And then you have a small developer or another developer that says, hey, you know what? I'm gonna build this, I'm gonna pull this and well, people are charging this and this is what I think I should pay. And you have two types of developers that we're dealing with, right? And that's, and us as a city and staff, and we're here to, actually, we shouldn't, as I'm learning, I think we're actually better enforcing and understanding that we have a complete policy. And this actually is a start, right? This gets us to understand that there's policies and procedures handed over to our, actually, we have sewer master plan, we have a infrastructure master plan. It meets it. So tomorrow morning, we don't have the meetings that we were having in the past because we have major.
The thing that I always say about the municipal code or the zoning code is it's the minimum. And so if you revise your minimum to be above where it's been, you're inherently, the projects should be better, right? These are the minimums we're asking people to do, right? The minimum standards that we're asking. We're bringing them in line with current state laws and other typical practices of other cities. However, they are maybe more stringent than what have historically been required, but they can be administered consistently across the board. And we believe that the implementation of this zoning code update will bring better projects overall for the community.
And I agree, you know, for a city that talks about just the future, forget the past, we talk a lot about the past. And we need to, because you avoid the mistakes, right, of the past. If you look at it, not to repeat the past, but to learn from the mistakes. And I mean, Walmart buying that land and telling the city, you're not gonna put another store in competition with us next. They just, and the city did it. Why? Why? You know, in hindsight, we wouldn't do that again because it really limited our future development.
Yep.
We can learn from that. You know, we don't, in a good zoning update like this, I mean, it puts it in black and white and it makes these rules consistent. We heard from Commissioner Mags, Supervisor Magzig, Clovis was successful because they came up with standards and they stuck to them. You know, and people thought, you know, their fees were too high. Who doesn't? But I mean, if, as long as they're fair and they're consistent, I think that's the point, but we learn from the mistakes in the past.
And I think the issue is developers want you to be consistent, because if my project's built to a certain, you know, standard, the project that's built next to it shouldn't be a lower standard because it's going to affect the value of my project, right? That's how developers think. And Clovis has done a very good job in terms of holding the line and saying, this is what we want. This is what you're going to pay. This is what you're going to build. And this is what it's going to look like. They've done that for decades. And what do you have there? You have what is it? Loma Vista, what's that master plan in the southwest?
Or ODAO.
Anyway, they have a plan that they've actually moved to Heritage Grove, which is north of Shepherd now, that they've built out that whole master plan in the southeast part of town. I think it's Loma Vista. And they had standards, it had parks, it had all these things. Well, that's kind of what Amberwood is, and we intend to hold all the standards that were adopted of the Amberwood specific plan to every developer that comes in there for a specific reason. Is that when one developer sees what standard is being held there, another developer will come in and have an expectation that my project will hold value.
Yep.
And so on and so forth. So again, yes, maintaining consistency amongst plans is a huge deal. And for the development community, that's all they want is consistency across the board.
I think that the mayor stating that, you know, we have to still look at the past and actually look at the forward, and actually, this is what we want, our standards, our community. That is so correct, but at the same time, I like the fact that what you said in regards to if some developers are saying, hey, you know, this is too much, and you stated that, you know what, if you have a phase 1, 2, and 3 project, that maybe, you know, you don't have to pick up the fee right now, but you can pick it up. And I think going back to what the mayor was saying is that we do want the developers to come to our community. We want them to be here. So I think that marrying what he's stating and what you're stating about, hey, if this fee is too much, can we, I guess it goes back to what they were saying, communication, get our staff to communicate with them and tell them, hey, you know what, we phase these costs down because we still want the standards. We don't want to lose the standards, and we don't want to lose our infrastructure, and we don't want to lose our future infrastructure. We don't want to lose our street plans. We don't want to lose our you know, our development, so.
And staff is firmly aware of the need to be flexible with our conditions as well as maybe timing of payment of fees. We've proposed to multiple developers, a payment schedule with inflation built into future payments in order to help facilitate their projects. And they've been receptive to that type of discussion because it helps their bottom line. It limits how much they have to finance on the front end and it helps get their project going. So the thing you will always get from staff with not cooperation, but coordination with the city manager's office is we want to do things that make sense. And but we have to do them within the bounds of what is needed for the city. So waiving of fees is not, in my personal opinion, the way to go about doing it. We still need to collect the revenues in order to fund infrastructure as part of the impact fee program. So what we would always propose is collect the total fee, but if it can be spread out over 3 years, let's do that instead.
Yeah, and Councilmember,
I apologize.
Rivera?
I have to leave. I have a 12:15 Zoom call, so I apologize. Thank you.
Thank you. Just to add to that, not every project is created equal, right? There are some projects that advance the priorities of the city more than others, right? And I think right now, all projects are important and they always will be. But when you look at, an affordable housing project, for example, with really high standards and the cost that that it incurs to develop that, we have a responsibility through, with our arena numbers to meet affordable housing goals, targets. And so we have the flexibility as a city to look at it on a project by project basis if we believe that there is a benefit to the city and to the public to defer fees for a certain amount of time. I agree with Deputy City Manager. It is very few and far between the case where waiving any sort of fees is actually the right way to go. But being flexible with, the type of project that it is and the amount of time that they have to pay these maybe not impact fees, but other fees that are associated with the project. The city council is always going to retain, unless some law passes, right, that restricts your ability to do that. So I think, holding the line with our zoning standards and development standards is the first step. And then, the fiscal aspect of it, I think, is always flexible.
I think it's adding value within the city. They'll pay. People will pay, like they pay in Clovis, if there's value. If they look at Selma and say, it's worth it to come here.
Absolutely.
That's the key right there. Making our city worth it to come here and locate your business here and build and put all that money and put all, many of these small developers, this is it for them. They don't have a lot of extra capital out there. They need to make their money work for them. And we need to find a way to have them invest in Selma. We have anything else today?
So, staff would just ask if you guys come across any revisions, questions, comments that require further clarification, you can forward those to staff and then we'll schedule a future first adoption.
Do we have a timeline as to when those comments should be received by and then what the timeline for adoption roughly looks like?
I would say maybe comments in the next 2 weeks and then we could schedule accordingly after that, maybe 60 days out. Unless the city.
It would just depend on what the council feels is appropriate timing to give you a chance to review everything.
60 days?
Do we want to plan first reading for 60 days with comments within the next 20 to 30 days?
Everybody good with that? Okay, sounds good.
All right. Thank you.
Yep, I think that's it. And we do have lunch provided for anybody that wants to stick around for lunch.
Thank you, appreciate that.
Thanks. Okay. And that would be all questions, right? Including structure?
Go ahead.
I would say that the comments that we're requesting today would be more pertaining to the zoning code update specifically. Obviously, infrastructure questions we can address on an as-needed basis. But in terms of the timeframe provided, we would like to see comments for the zoning ordinance within the next 30 days. And we're planning for a first reading in the next 60 days of just the zoning ordinance update.
Thank you. Thanks for everybody's work on this. Appreciate it.
Thank you.